When we say that God feels distant, we're not usually talking about miles. We're talking about the feeling of abandonment. And here's the real issue. If God actually pulls back from us when we are at our lowest, then Jesus did not reveal God. He actually contradicted him. And that belief that God pulls away, it didn't come from Jesus. Welcome to Thinking Aloud, the show where we expose cultural Christianity, dismantle the bad belief systems that keep us stuck so that we can think our way to freedom through the power of Jesus Christ. And I want to tackle that idea today that God is a distant God. It is just not true. So let's name the problem right off the bat, that closeness with God is conditional. See, a lot of us inherited a version of God that sounds spiritual, but it functions like emotional neglect. We were taught, sometimes by a sermon, sometimes by a song, that closeness with God is a reward for performance, that he stays near when you're faithful, but when you're obedient or when you're disobedient, then God pulls away. When your life looks clean and coherent, then God is near. But if your life is messy and it's disordered, then somehow God can't stand that, so he pulls back. And the idea that when life gets messy, God pulls back, that is never ever seen in the life of Jesus. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. But whenever we begin to feel like God is distant, we never use the word abandonment because nobody would come right out and say what they're really feeling, like God abandoned me. We use churchy language. We say things like, well, I'm in a dry season, or the heavens are like brass. Or we tend to look inward and say things like, well, I must have a secret sin. Because underneath that vocabulary is a very human, very painful conclusion that there must be something about me that created a distance that God isn't willing to cross. I remember in my own life, especially growing up as a young teenager who felt the call of God on his life, there were so many times when I messed up and I just felt like I couldn't get my life together. And it just seemed like God was distant. But it wasn't true. He was always there, but I didn't feel him. And of course, the style of Christianity I grew up in was very performance-based. So it was all about what you were doing for God. And if you weren't doing these things for God, then, well, God probably wasn't paying attention to you other than to judge you for messing up so much. Many times, as we go through our lives as Christians, we oftentimes feel more like paroled sinners than we do children of God. We struggle to see God as a loving Father that is always there, that will never leave us nor forsake us. And we feel like God is a judge just waiting for us to mess up. He set us free from sin, but the moment we mess up, the moment we can't get something together, we get thrown right back into the slammer and we don't feel God's presence anymore. And that's a fair weather father who only shows up when things are good, when you're doing the right things. That is not the Abba of Jesus that he presents to us. And here's the real issue with all of that is once this belief, this idea that God is distant when life is hard or we don't have things together, when that idea sets in, our entire spiritual life is affected. Prayer becomes more of a performance. We tend to beat ourselves up more, thinking that somehow if we beat ourselves up enough that God will have mercy upon us. Honesty feels really dangerous because we don't really want to be honest with God. We don't want to tick him off any more than he's already ticked off at us. And so we keep our feelings to ourselves. But here's the deal with that. God already knows how we feel. And the Psalms are full of prayers from the different authors of the Psalms about, God, why do you feel so distant? Why do you feel so far away? God wants us to be honest. His shoulders are big enough to handle our questions, our frustrations, and even our anger at him when at times we get angry because we feel like he's let us down. And then even our doubts seem to be disqualifications because we think, well, I don't know about all of this stuff. And if I'm not certain about what I believe in, then God won't be pleased with me. And if he's not pleased with me, then he's going to be distant from us. But through this whole thing, we don't stop wanting God. We really want God. We just stop trusting that his posture is turned towards us. I remember this feeling so many times throughout my Christian life, my walk with Jesus, where I did not trust that the Father really was good, and I didn't really trust that he was loving, because there were so many times when I felt that he just wasn't there. Now, that is not true. God has always been with me, but oftentimes we feel the silence of God and we take that as distant. And there's an emotional cost to this. And that emotional cost isn't just a theological error. It really affects our nervous system. When we believe that God is prone to leaving or abandoning us, we live in a state of super hyper vigilance. We're constantly scanning our lives, asking ourselves and worrying, am I okay with God right now? Is he pleased with me? Is there some unconfessed sin in my life? Did I wait too long to repent? Did my doubts and questions cost me access to him? And it doesn't help that well-meaning preachers who's living under the same lie that God does abandonment, they tell us constantly that we better make sure that everything in our life is right with God, that we better stop playing games with God, and that God's so holy he won't look upon our sins, so you better make sure that all the sin is out of your life. But in this system, silence is transformed into this kind of evidence that somehow God's silence during periods of our life means that he's withdrawn from our life. That's not faith. That's a trauma response. And it's exhausting to try to maintain a relationship with a God that you believe might turn his back on you at any given moment. We've been told that God turned his back on Jesus on the cross so that he would never have to turn his back on you. But that's a lie. God never turned his back on Jesus. And if God did turn his back on Jesus, then how can you and I really believe that God never will turn his back on us? Because we look at our sin all the time. We look at the mess ups in our life all the time, and we think that that's, what that God's looking at is all he's looking at is our mess ups. But that's simply not true. So we've named the problem that God, closeness with God is unconditional. So now let's expose the flaw, that distance is God's response to human weakness. Distance is God's response to human weakness. That is a flaw in our theology. And here's where the distant God story breaks down. That story assumes that distance with God is his response to human weakness. But that story is nowhere to be found in the life of Jesus. If distance is how God responds to our failure, then the incarnation, the birth of Jesus into the world, makes absolutely no sense. Jesus does not pull back when people fall apart. And we must remember that Jesus said, I only do what I see the Father do. I only say what I hear the Father saying. And so if Jesus is moving closer to people, if Jesus himself is known as the friend of sinners, then because Jesus is just like the Father, and if we've seen Jesus, we've seen the Father, then the Father is the friend to sinners. And what we see out of the life of Jesus isn't withdrawal. We see Jesus constantly moving closer to people. He moved closer to the sick. He touched people that he wasn't supposed to touch. He moved towards those who were shamed and on the outcast of society. Jesus moved toward the morally compromised. He hung out with prostitutes and tax collectors. Here's the thing about Jesus. Jesus was always with people he wasn't supposed to be with, in places he wasn't supposed to be, doing things that God's not supposed to do. And yet, here Jesus is, never failing to reach out to a broken person. And here's another thing I want you to consider, that Jesus never ever told a broken person, come back to me when you've cleaned up your act and I'll stay close. As a matter of fact, when I think about Peter and how Peter denied Jesus 3 times after swearing to Jesus he would die for him, Jesus didn't abandon Peter. Jesus pulled Peter close, and Jesus restored Peter. Jesus never rebuked Peter for lying or for rejecting him. Not one time did Jesus ever scold Peter for what Peter did. He didn't abandon him. He didn't withdraw from him. He moved closer to him. Let me say it this way, that God moves towards us in our deepest, darkest point. That's where you'll find God the most in your life. It's not in the areas where you're so cleaned up and think that you have everything together. No, God comes in and meets us at our deepest, darkest point because that's where we need him the most. Jesus never allowed religious or emotional or societal distance to stop him from touching people that needed to be touched. When I think about him touching the leper, he was not allowed culturally to touch a leper. That would have made him unclean. And yet he touched the leper, and instead of him becoming unclean, the leper became clean. The very thing that was supposed to create distance between a person and Jesus was the very thing that Jesus used to come near to someone. And here's another thought, that since Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, then God does not manage humanity from a distance. God enters the dirt of humanity. He enters our darkness. He enters our pain. He enters those places of hurt and brokenness in our lives that we think repel God away from us, and yet God is saying, no, that's exactly where I will be found. In the midst of your pain, in the midst of your brokenness, in the midst of your trauma and your hurt, God will be found in the midst of our darkness. So as we move along in this, I want to help us reframe this through the lens of Jesus. And here's the belief that we're going to reform. God is always near. That's how we're going to reform this idea that God is distant. We're going to confront that lie. We've done that already. And we're going to say the truth, and that is this, that God comes near. See, Christianity makes a radical claim that not that God tolerates you, but God dwells with you. Christianity makes this claim that God does not throw away humanity, which he could have done. It doesn't say that he tolerates humanity or that he even feels sorry for humanity. But God's desire has always been to dwell with human beings. In John 1:14, we read that the Word, that's Jesus before he became Jesus, the Word, the Logos, became flesh. The Word became Jesus in human form, and he dwelt among us. As a matter of fact, one of Jesus's names is Emmanuel, God with us. So Jesus doesn't reveal a God who waits for us to climb our way back to him. He reveals a God who steps into the mess while we're still in it. What an amazing God. And if Jesus is what God is like, and we know that he is because he said he is, then God does not do abandonment. I want you to hear that. If you are struggling with feeling like God has turned his back on you for whatever reason, if you feel like you're in a dry season or the heavens are brass, or you feel like your sin has caused God to turn away from you, the good news is that God does not do abandonment. He did not leave humanity to live and die in their sin. He came to dwell among us. And that means this, that the distance that you may be feeling may not be, and is not, I want to say it that way, it is not God stepping away at all. It could be just a collapse of this belief system that is faulty. See, I believe that God wants us to understand he does not do abandonment. Not once, not ever. See, silence does not equal absence. Now, we have to be honest with ourselves. Silence is real. The silence of God is real. There are times when God does seem to pull back. He's right there with us because Jesus said, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. And that means the Father will never leave us nor forsake us. But there are times when it seems like God is silent, and we certainly know that pain is real and trauma and hurt. They're all real. But silence is not the same thing as absence. And absence is not the same thing as abandonment. Romans 8 tells us that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing. No doubt, no failure, not even the feeling of being alone. And Jesus reveals a Father who remains present even when it seems he remains hidden. You know, I'm reminded of Jesus when he said in John 14:20, in that day you will know that I'm in the Father. And then he said, and you're in me, and I'm in you. And so if I'm in Jesus, and Jesus is in me, and Jesus is in the Father, that means I'm in the Father. That means I'm always in the Father. I'm always in Jesus, and Jesus is always in me. There is no abandonment at all. I remember one time I was going through the darkest period of my life. And I had lost everything, and I felt so alone, and I felt so lost, and I felt so disappointed in God because I felt like I had done everything right, and yet everything still fell apart. All the prayers seemed to have gone unanswered. All the promises that I felt like God had made me just seemed to be of nothing. And I remember telling God so many times, God, I feel so lost. I feel like you're so far away. I feel, Father God, like you're just not there. And I remember one night I was standing in my kitchen and I said that to God. And I said, God, I just feel so lost and alone, abandoned. And I heard the Lord say into my spirit, son, you're not lost. I know exactly where you are. And that gave me hope because I knew that I had not been forgotten by God. Now, I still felt forgotten. I still felt lost. But it was great to know that God knew exactly where I was. And I've come to learn, and as I look back now, I know that God was with me all the time. He never abandoned me. He never, ever let me alone. So we have to understand that silence doesn't equal absence, but silence can and at times is real. And the danger isn't the silence. The danger is interpreting that silence through a false story about God's character. And I know, again, from personal experience, that when I went through that season of my life, I took the character of God into question, and I felt like God could not be trusted. And it took me a while to work through that with God. And here's the thing. I remember one time I was in Louisville, Kentucky at a conference, and on a Saturday morning, I woke up at like 4 a.m. And as soon as I woke up, I heard the Lord ask me the question. He said, Michael, you don't trust me, do you? You don't believe that I have your back. And again, I was still going through a hard time, and I said, no, I don't, because I prayed, I did the right things, and you didn't come through for me. So no, I don't trust you. And you know what? God didn't rebuke me. God didn't tell me how awful I was. God didn't tell me, how could you believe that after all the good things I've done for you? God let me have my feelings. He let me have my pain, and he allowed me to project that pain onto him. And I promise you, not one single time did he leave me or abandon me because I questioned his goodness and his character. Now, I'm on the other side of that, and I can tell you straight up, I believe with all my heart that God is always love, God is always good, and God always has my back. But I had to go through that season, and I had to learn that. And God allowed me to learn it. And at times he was silent, but he was allowing me to process all of that. And he was constantly working within me, helping me, even though I didn't feel like he was. But I can promise you, he was. So I want to give us a little simple practice. And this isn't a fix, but it's a way to unlearn this lie that God's response to human weakness is distance. The next time that you feel that distance, the next time the silence feels like rejection, don't try to pray harder and don't perform. Just use this simple practice. God, if you are like Jesus, then you are not backing away right now. See, many of us, we would never think that Jesus would abandon people, but somehow we think that God is different than Jesus, that the Father's different than Jesus, and he's not. He's exactly like Jesus. He's always been like Jesus. We sometimes just struggle to see that. So if you're going through a hard time right now, just sit quietly and say this out loud if you're able, but saying it silently is fine. But if you can, say it out loud. God, if you really are like Jesus, then you are not backing away from me right now. And then just stop and let that sit. And you might have to repeat that several times. And I would just encourage you to take some deep breaths and just say that several times until you feel it. Notice what's resisting that statement. Notice the thoughts that come up. And you might think things like, yeah, but he didn't come through for me, or yeah, he hasn't answered that prayer. And then go right back to that. God, you're just like Jesus. You are not backing away from me right now. But also notice what softens in your thoughts and your feelings. Notice the parts of you that are terrified to believe that God's really good. See, some people are terrified to believe that God's good because we've developed this notion and this belief system that God is not as good as what Jesus said he is. And so that causes us to continue to perform. And really what happens is this, that we feel good about when we perform well, and we think that God owes us, not realizing that the Father's going to bless you whether you do well or not, because he's a good, good Father. So as we close out this episode, I just want to leave you with this closing reflection. And that is this, that God doesn't do abandonment. So if God does not do abandonment, then your pain is not proof that you were left. And it's okay to tell God about the pain. It's okay to even blame God for the pain. He's big enough to take that, and he will walk you through it. I can promise you that. So the distance that you feel right now, it may not be distance at all. It actually may be grief over things that you're going through. It might be exhaustion. And honestly, it also very well could be the growing pains of God allowing you to learn to stand on your own as you learn to trust him that he will never leave you nor forsake you. You know, trust is not built in times when things are going good. Trust is built when all hell is breaking loose and everything is around us. And we have to say, like the psalmist said, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. See, that's trust. When you're going through the valley of the shadow of death and it feels like everything within you is dying, you have to trust that God is with you. And I promise you, He is. Jesus reveals a Father who comes closer, not farther away, when things fall apart. And if this has helped you, I've developed a resource that you can get. It's totally free. You can find the link in the description below. I would love for you to take that and use it to help you go deeper into this subject. And if this has helped you at all, would you like this episode? Would you like it? Would you subscribe if you haven't already? And would you share this with somebody that maybe needs to hear it? And also, if you are in the West Tennessee area, we would love to invite you to Renovatus Church. This is the church that I pastor. We currently meet on Sunday evenings at 6 p.m. at 202 East Court Street in downtown Dyersburg. We actually meet in another church's facility. They're gracious enough to loan us their facility on Sunday evenings. We would love to have you come be a part. You can find out more information at our website. And again, all of the links are in the description below. Until next time, I want to leave you with this. You were created by love, out of love, to be loved, and to love. And my prayer for you is that you will learn to love loud and love well. God bless.